Dutch Schultz was born Arthur Flegenheimer in 1902 to German-Jewish parents. He dropped out of school in the 8th grade, started robbing street corner dice games, and was sent to juvenile prison at age 17 in 1920 for burglary. Released from jail in late 1920, he started working for Schultz Trucking Company. He took up the name Dutch Schultz, and he jumped headfirst into the lucrative world of bootlegging beer in the Bronx during Prohibition. He quickly became known for his brutality and his penchant for murder. By the late 1920s, he and his partner Joey Noel were the only non-Italian gang that could rival the Mafia, and their territory stretched from the Bronx to Washington Heights and Harlem. A gang war with the Irish gangster Legs Diamond left his partner and mentor Joey Noel dead, and a few weeks later, Arnold the Brain Rothstein, who was the first godfather of 20th century organized crime period really, who was portrayed in Boardwalk Empire as a central character, he was gunned down. And it was probably on Dutch Schultz's orders because Legs Diamond, the man who had killed Schultz's partner, Joey Noel, was Rothstein's protege. Either way, Dutch Schultz was now left alone to run one of the city's biggest bootlegging rings and take in the millions of dollars in profit that came with it, and he became one of the richest gangsters in America. While Dutch was flush with cash, he was notoriously stingy paying his employees, which led to several vicious internal feuds, the most notorious of which pitted him against his former Irish hitman, Vincent Call, who earned the nickname Mad Dog Call when he shot down a small child while he was trying to kill Schultz. In 1932, Dutch's shooters caught up with Call and they machine gunned him to death in a drugstore phone booth. During the 10 or so years at his peak, law enforcement blamed Dutch Schultz for 136 murders. I don't know where they got that exact number from. And his organization grossed about $20 million in 1929, which would be hundreds of millions of dollars in today's money. So when Prohibition ended in 1933, all the gangsters that had grown fat during the easy money days of bootlegging were looking for a new hustle. Dutch Schultz found himself one of the best. He strong-armed his way into the Harlem policy racket. Now, policy was probably invented by Caribbean and black gangsters like Madame Stephanie St. Clair and served a mostly black and Spanish customer base uptown Manhattan. Policy was the forerunner of today's state lottery system. People picked 3 numbers from 1 to 9, and the 3-digit number was based on the outcome of various things like a combination of the results from horse racing tracks around the country, so the number couldn't be fixed. Or so everyone thought. It turns out Dutch Schultz had an accountant on his payroll, Otto Berman, who was nicknamed Abba Dabba for the magic he worked with numbers. Now, Abba Dabba Berman's amazing ability to calculate odds in his head in a matter of seconds gave Dutch a way to control the winning number. Schultz intimidated or murdered most of the primary Latin and black gangsters that were running the policy rackets, and since his accountant, Abba Dabba, helped with rigging the winning numbers, Schultz had found the perfect moneymaker to replace bootleg beer. The war between Dutch Schultz and black Harlem gangsters like Madame St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson was told in the heavily fictionalized film Hoodlum with Tim Roth playing Dutch. With his grip on the New York policy racket cemented and his profits still rolling in, Schultz was given the dubious distinction of public enemy number 1 by the Federal Justice Department. He replaced Al Capone as the single most powerful gangster in America, according to the federal government. When Lucky Luciano created the National Crime Commission in 1931, Dutch Schultz got a seat at the table. But as a non-Italian, he was on the outside looking in. He just didn't know it yet. Then, like Al Capone a few years before, Dutch was hit with tax evasion charges. His lawyer got the case moved to a rural town in upstate New York where Schultz's cash was able to influence the jury, and he was found not guilty. But his days as public enemy number 1 were numbered. Gangland legend has it that Dutch went in front of Luciano and the freshly minted Mafia Commission to ask for permission to whack his arch nemesis, New York State Prosecutor Thomas Dewey. The other crime leaders balked at the heat that would come from killing the high-profile prosecutor, and instead, Dutch Schultz himself, along with his accountant Abba Dabba Berman and 2 of their bodyguards, were murdered in a New York, New Jersey steakhouse. Dutch was shot while urinating, and he actually survived in the hospital for 22 hours before he died, having accomplished all his criminal success at the tender age of just 33. Now, as Dutch Schultz lay on the hospital gurney slowly dying, he babbled a stream of consciousness, a string of words that struck a reporter at the scene as very interesting, and he recorded them. And the last words of Dutch Schultz have since been used by dozens of writers and songwriters and novels and songs. One writer even used Dutch's deathbed ravings as a coded message about the Illuminati in a novel he wrote. 1990 National Book Award finalist E.L. Doctorow used Schultz as a primary character in his novel Billy Bathgate, and a movie was made based on the book starring Dustin Hoffman and Bruce Willis. Now, not long before he died, Schultz figured he was headed for prison at some time, probably for tax evasion. So he put $7 million in cash and bonds and jewelry into a specially built safe, and he hid it somewhere in upstate New York. This story is actually considered probably to be true by most researchers and gangster scholars, and there's still treasure hunters looking for Dutch Schultz's lost fortune, tramping through the woods in upstate New York. Arthur Flegenheimer, aka Dutch Schultz, was the most powerful non-Italian left in organized crime after Prohibition, and his name still ranks high on the list of most infamous gangsters of any race, color, or creed, even 80 years after his death. Herbie Sperling was one of the biggest heroin dealers of the 1960s and early 70s on the entire East Coast. He helped move hundreds or maybe thousands of kilos of heroin from the Italian mafia during the era of the so-called French connections. He was a middleman between the mafia and the biggest black and Latin dealers in New York. Sperling got his start in crime working as a gopher for one of America's most powerful and dangerous mob bosses, Vito Genovese. Sperling was introduced to the heroin business specifically in the late 50s. He was making deliveries for Genovese's soldier, Joe Valachi. Joe Valachi, of course, went on to be the first made man to turn informant and the first actual member to verify the existence of La Cosa Nostra, and he went in front of U.S. Senate and testified, the Valachi hearings. There's a book, the Valachi Papers, and perhaps that's where Herbie Sperling learned to hate informants so much, which we'll hear more about in a minute. So Sperling's boss, Joe Valachi, went down for heroin distribution in 1959 before he turned federal witness. Vito Genovese and several other mob bosses also went away for heroin around the same time. And the Italians supposedly wanted to get out of the drug business. But what they really did was turn it over to guys like Herbie Sperling. A few selected mafia contacts supplied Sperling with almost unlimited amounts of heroin, and he middleman the loads off to the black and Latin dealers that controlled the exploding street-level heroin trade in the late 60s and early 70s in New York and up and down the eastern seaboard. Sperling was known for his use of violence on the streets, and he was the prime suspect in a murder that left a headless and limbless torso. The body was identified by teeth the medical examiner had found inside the stomach. The victim had been so badly beaten, he'd swallowed his teeth. They were smashed right out of his jaws. Sperling was eventually indicted for selling heroin and cocaine. When the feds came to arrest him at the Long Island house that his mother owned and he spent the night at sometimes, the arresting agents told him if he cooperated, they'd let his mother go. And Sperling told them, listen, if you guys have a beef with her, that's her problem. Don't lay it on me. The old lady has to take her own weight. So that's the kind of guy Herbie Sperling was. So Sperling's story even gets more interesting after he goes to jail. He was one of the first drug traffickers to get a life sentence without the possibility of parole, but he wasn't done yet. While he was in Atlanta federal prison in 1977, just starting his sentence, he was indicted for hiring 3 black inmates to murder a guy named Vincent Papa. Papa was a low-level mobster that had orchestrated the theft of tens of millions of dollars of drugs from the New York police evidence room. And the powers that be high up in the mafia were worried that he was about to start naming big names, and he had to go. So Papa was stabbed to death in Atlanta prison. 2 black inmates ended up being convicted of murdering Papa, but Sperling was acquitted of the conspiracy to hire them to do so. Fast forward to 1980, Sperling's doing time in Lewisburg prison, the so-called mafia row in New York, and he's there with the infamous Nicky Barnes, who's fresh off the streets of Harlem. This was the time when Barnes decided to turn informant against his old partners. So the feds used Herbie Sperling as a test for Nicky Barnes. Nicky told Sperling he wanted to set up a drug deal out in the real world, the free world, to trade cocaine for heroin. Herbie's son, Nicholas Sperling, was caught up in the FBI sting and sent to federal prison, and Herbie had some pretty choice words for Nicky Barnes when he popped up in a 1991 documentary about Lewisburg Federal Prison.
They get somebody, they arrest him for a lot of crimes that they allege he committed. Now the guy doesn't want to go to jail, so what does he do? He trades in 30 or 40 other people for himself so he don't go to jail. That's what Nicky Barnes did to my son. My son was accused of being involved in a drug conspiracy. Total lie. The kid is 100% innocent. The only reason they did it is because of me being in jail, obvious to put some kind of pressure on me, and I don't make up stories about nobody. I don't play that game.
Nicky Barnes, as I recall, was a big-time heroin salesman, wasn't he?
Nicky Barnes is a girl, and I hope we have this on TV. Nicky Barnes is a girl. That's what he is. I don't know what he was or what he wasn't. I don't know the man. That's the whole point of everything. I happen to be...
What do you mean by Nicky Barnes is a girl?
He's a girl. He's a fag. He's a punk.
So what kind of...
In fact, I shouldn't say he's a punk and a fag because I'm insulting punks and fags.
Herbie Sperling's almost 80 years old. He's still alive. He's still in federal prison. He's serving the remainder of his sentence in a medical facility. Herbie Sperling, last of the old-time tough Jewish street guys. The Purple Gang, which hails from my hometown of Detroit, was the only major organized crime group with an all-Jewish leadership during the Prohibition gangster era. They got their name from their Jewish neighbors who said they reminded them of spoiled meat, purple. While there were many very, very powerful Jewish gangsters on the East Coast and in Chicago and across the Midwest, obviously, they were all allied with non-Jews, mainly the Italians. But in Detroit, the Purple Gang was the most powerful group of gangsters at one point during the 1920s, and their hierarchy was all Jewish. They were the key suppliers of bootleg whiskey to America's gangster number one, Al Capone. The Detroit police pinned 500 murders on them, and during their reign, Detroit actually had a higher murder rate than New York and Chicago. The narrow Detroit River separates the city from Canada, where alcohol never underwent prohibition and was still legal, and 500,000 cases of Canadian whiskey were being smuggled across the Detroit River every single month in the mid-20s, most of it controlled by the Purple Gang. Detroit was wide open, as it had grown so fast that the government and police couldn't really keep up. Led by the four Bernstein brothers, the Purple Gang thrived in this environment. They ran opium dens, illegal gambling, extortion rackets, and alcohol, of course. They employed one of the era's most infamous national outlaws, Fred Killer Burke, to execute the first machine gun murders in Detroit history. In 1927, there's a triple homicide dubbed the Miraflores Massacre. Burke later died in a Michigan State prison for killing a cop in the western rural part of the state. The Purple Gang not only supplied liquor to Al Capone, they helped him set up the most infamous murder of the era, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Capone was at war with the Bugs Moran gang back in Chicago. Capone had a phone call placed to Moran, which offered to sell him a load of stolen Purple Gang whiskey. And Bugs Moran agreed to meet up and buy the load, but he ended up not going. 7 men who went in his place were lined up against a wall and shot to death by guys dressed in police uniforms. Police knew that Moran's gang had been hijacking Purple Gang shipments of whiskey to Al Capone, so the Purples immediately became the prime suspects. Witnesses in the neighborhood of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre identified a bunch of Purple Gang members as having been in and out of the rooming house across the street from the garage where the massacre occurred in the days leading up to the murders, but none of them ended up being charged in the crime. Of course, like it always does in the underworld, the Purples' violence began to turn inward. The 1931 Collingwood Massacre was another triple murder, this time of a rival faction of Jewish bootleggers. 1931 was also the year that Lucky Luciano formed the National Crime Commission, and Italian gangsters became the dominant ethnic group in American organized crime. The Purples' time was coming to a close, and in 1935, Abe Bernstein peacefully handed over many of his rackets to the Italians, but the Purple Gang wasn't quite dead. Harry Millman was a younger generation Purple, known for his good looks, his evil ways, and his hatred for the Italian mafia. In addition to his own rackets, Millman was going around mafia-controlled brothels and gambling joints, robbing them, beating up the customers. Then he even spit in the face of Scarface Joe Bomarito, one of Detroit's top mafia bosses. So one night in 1937, it was his time to go. He was in Boski's Deli, which was a popular spot in Detroit's Jewish 12th Street neighborhood. Now, in one of those strange historical oddities, Boski's Deli was owned by the parents of convicted 1980s Wall Street fraudster Ivan Boesky, who grew up in Detroit and made the cover of Time magazine in the 1980s as a symbol of Wall Street excess and greed. So that night in 1937, Purple Gang killer Harry Millman was in Boesky's Deli, and in comes two members of the Mafia's Murder Inc. hit squad from New York. They had been sent by the Mafia Commission to take care of Millman, and they gunned him down in front of dozens of witnesses, none of which, of course, would come forward and pinpoint who the shooters were. America's only Jewish mob, the Purple Gang, had a big impact on pop culture, with several movies being made about them. Even Elvis Presley name-checked them in his Jailhouse Rock song. The whole rhythm section was the Purple Gang, he sang. As an epilogue, several Purple Gang old-timers were convicted of murdering and burning the body of a Michigan state senator in 1945. And even more recently, up through the late 1970s, Sam the Mustache Norber, who was a young affiliate during the later years of the Purples, sort of during Harry Millman's time. During the 1960s and 70s, he became one of Detroit's primary heroin wholesalers. He supplied some of the Motor City's top black drug kingpins. The Jewish Purple Gang was one of the key groups in the criminal history of Detroit and one of America's most successful criminal groups, and it was the only all-Jewish gang during the Prohibition era.